One thing that is fascinating, I think, about the French Revolution is the role that women play in it, right? Like I said, this is a pretty radical revolution that will touch on economics, on politics, on society. And so women, including poor women, will often have an important role in it. So, for example, the events that will eventually lead to the execution of King Louis XVI are essentially touched off by a group of angry housewives and mothers who are mad because they're having difficulty buying bread. Bread has become very expensive. There's not enough of it. And these economic issues kind of underlie the French Revolution. And these women whose duty it is traditionally to make sure that their families are fed are very frustrated about this and will actually march on Versailles, the palace where the king is, and them doing this forces the king to then go to Paris, which is the center of the revolution, and eventually that will lead to the king's execution. So the key thing about this, and what we're going to try and do in this final part, is talk about how the French Revolution is going to connect to issues of gender and race, right? We have people talking about equality, and the question then is, why doesn't, who gets to be equal in a sense, right? When people talk about equality, who gets to be equal? In the American Revolution, when there was talk of equality, it basically meant white men. In the French Revolution, because it's more radical, notions of equality will become broader. And that's something that we're going to try and deal with in this section. So one person who kind of asked this question, if all men are equal, what of women, is a woman named Olympia de Guiche. Now, it's hard to find like a feminist movement in like, say, the 10th century or the 11th century. You can certainly find remarkable women, but it's hard to find something we could call like a feminist movement. And that's because I think they lived in a period of hierarchy, where hierarchy seemed natural. So the idea that a woman would be subordinate to her father or husband isn't so strange when her father is subordinate to the king or her husband is subordinate to his father. But once you start talking about equality and saying, yeah, all men are equal, then women will naturally start saying, well, why aren't we equal, right? And like I said, a woman who does this is Olympia de Guiche. She will argue in particular for political rights for women. And she will do this basically as a writer. She was a really, really good writer. And she will even write what's called a parody of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Basically, there was this revolutionary document that explained how people should have rights, but by people it meant men, and it was called Declarations of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. She made a kind of satire of it called Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Citizen. And her argument was basically, hey, look, I'm intelligent, I'm educated. If all men have the right to vote, why don't I? You could have a man who is a drunk, who is a gambler, who is ignorant and uneducated and dumb, and he has the right to vote, and I, a virtuous, intelligent, educated woman, do not. That does not make sense. And she will say these ideas publicly. Now, she will eventually be executed, but not so much because of her views on women, but because she was part of a group that wasn't as radical as others. She was a revolutionary. She thought France should be a republic. She just opposed a lot of the violence that was going on. She didn't see the point of French people killing each other in the way that the radicals were doing, and so they dealt with her by killing her. So she is going to be killed, not because of her views for women, but because she was not a radical enough revolutionary. Now, writing is certainly important. I don't want to take away from that. The ideas can mobilize people, can convince them to take particular action. Writing is important. But there are women who are going to do more than just write about politics. Who are going to take direct political action. An example of that is this woman, Charlotte Corday, and you can see her there in the upper right. Charlotte Corday, like Olympia de Guiche, was a revolutionary. She thought that France should be a republic. She supported the revolutionary, but she was not so radical. Rather, she was a moderate revolutionary who was a patriot and just didn't see the point of French people slaughtering each other because they disagreed about the direction the revolution should take. Right? So she seems in many ways to be a very reasonable person. Right? She wasn't anti-revolutionary. She was a moderate revolutionary and someone who loved her country, and so was disturbed by the idea of French people killing each other, even killing fellow revolutionaries simply because they weren't the right kind of revolutionary. But you can see how even a rational person could become violent. There was a man named Marat. He's there in the lower left. Marat was a radical revolutionary, This may seem like kind of a weird picture because he's like in a bathtub. He, early on during the revolution, to escape from the people who wanted to like arrest him, he went through the sewers and got a really bad skin disease. And so he often spent time soaking in a tub. And he was a journalist, and he wrote all these newspaper articles in his own newspaper saying, we need to kill more people, that the revolution has many enemies and we need to execute them and get rid of them. And so Charlotte Corday blamed him for the death of so many French people, and she was right. I mean, he was key to, all these people being killed because he kept writing these inflammatory news articles calling for more people to be killed. And what she did was she said, she sent a message telling him that she had a list of traitors to the country and wanted to meet him to give him the list. He said, okay, come on by. And she came by, and then she stabbed him to death with a knife. Right, so she's going to assassinate this guy. And it's this curious kind of thing, and it just shows the problems with how these revolutions can get so radical. She was upset because this guy was calling for more violence, and her solution was to kill him. That highlights that problem. But what I want to emphasize here that's fascinating to me about this is that here you have a woman taking political action. Right? Now, I don't want to justify assassination, but my point is she is killing a person over political ideas. That's certainly a political action. Right? So she's not simply writing, she's actually becoming involved directly in politics. And one thing I think is fascinating is when she was put on trial, she admitted to killing the guy. It shouldn't have been a very long trial. I mean, she surrendered herself after she killed him. But the government spent a lot of time trying to prove that a man was involved. They spent all this time trying to prove that she had a lover that had made her do this. And it turned out she was just acting alone. And this is because even in the Enlightenment, there was this view that men were rational and women were emotional. And because men are rational, they become involved in politics, and women are emotional, so they can't be. And so they wanted to prove that rather than rationally coming to the decision that she should kill this guy, she was emotionally attached to a lover, and that's what led her to kill the journalist Marat. But that's not the case at all. Right, so we still have some problems in terms of ideas of equality. Right, even the Enlightenment thinkers who emphasize reason, many of them still will argue that women, because they lack reason, should not have a political role. People like Olympia de Guiche and Charlotte Corday will challenge that and eventually will be successful. But I just want to emphasize the Enlightenment was pretty good at still coming up with ways to discriminate against people, even as it declared itself to be rational. Now, another logical question when we ask this question, well, who is equal, is what about race? Right? And we can see that question being dealt with in particular in Saint-Domingue, as it was called then, or what we now call Haiti. Haiti, you may think of it now, unfortunately, it's a relatively poor country, but in this time period, it was an extraordinarily wealthy French colony. It was very important for the production of coffee and sugar, which were extraordinarily valuable. Right? Which were extraordinarily valuable. However, this wealthy French colony was built on a system of slavery connected to a racial hierarchy in which race played a large role in determining your place in society. So, for example, the people on top were whites, and they called them literally the grand and the petite whites, the big and the little whites. Big whites were whites who owned lots of property and lots of slaves. Little whites did not. Below them, you had a mixed race population who were typically free, as well as free blacks. So you had this kind of group in the middle. And then you also had enslaved blacks who made up something like 80-90% of the population. Right? So this is definitely a slave society in which the vast majority of people living here were slaves of African descent. So, and as I stressed earlier in trying to understand slavery, this is a system of inequality backed up by violence. How else can you control 80% of the population and force them to work for the benefit of the rest and deny them the fruits of their labor except by violence? Right? So this is a system of inequality backed up by violence. That's any slave system is like that. But the French Revolution, which declares that all men are created equal, some people will say, well, does that include black men? And not only will a lot of black men say yes, also white men will. I'm doing that on purpose to say men because, unfortunately, as we just discussed, women are kind of excluded for, irrational reasons. But in any case, the French Revolution is going to encourage people to question this kind of racial hierarchy, to say, well, why does it matter what your race is? People who are reasonable, who are rational, should be treated equally, right? So this is going to encourage people to kind of question this whole system. Now, one thing that is fascinating about this history, I think, is in particular this man, Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture was born into slavery in Haiti and Saint-Domingue, but he had a relatively tolerant master who taught him how to read and then gave him a job on the plantation that involved him taking managerial roles. And he showed that he was very intelligent. And eventually the master, who was, like I said, in a sense, an enlightened slave master, if there is such a thing, but I guess it's relative, he would eventually free Toussaint Louverture, right? So Toussaint Louverture had the experience of being a slave. And while he still had a relatively, like I said, enlightened master who would allow him to learn to read and write, and who did free him, the key point I want to stress is Toussaint Louverture said, no, thank you, did not say, oh, I don't want to be free. He was willing to be free. I mean, slavery is still terrible, even if you have a so-called enlightened master. But he is free, and he actually will do really well and become the owner of plantations and of slaves. And this sounds really weird if you're familiar with American slavery, but there were people like Toussaint Louverture who were of African descent who did own plantations and own slaves. Now, what's going to happen is there is going to be a slave rebellion inspired in part by the French Revolution while Toussaint Louverture is on Haiti. Now, here's the key thing. Slave revolts almost always fail. In fact, in all of human history that we have records for, only one slave revolt actually worked, and that was the revolt in Haiti. So slave revolts usually fail. The fact that one actually worked is unique because, like I said, we only know of one slave revolt that actually worked, this one. They typically fail because slaves are seen by their masters correctly as a threat. They're seen as rebellious, and of course they are, because who wants to work for other people and not get the profit from your work? And so they purposely try and make sure that slaves are divided. For example, they'll bring in slaves from different parts of Africa who can't talk to each other because they speak different dialects. They will also try and make sure that slaves do not learn to have any kind of managerial or administrative skills. They certainly don't want slaves to learn how to use weapons. So typically slave rebellions fail, right? Slaves are kept low. They're not allowed to learn how to manage people. They're not allowed to learn how to administer. And of course, how can you win a slave revolt when you don't know how to organize people and manage them and administer? So slave revolts, except for this one, almost always fail. And what's fascinating about Toussaint Louverture is when the slave rebellion broke out, his first instinct was to actually go try and protect his master. And he did that. And then what's fascinating was the slave revolt actually was starting to lose. The slaves began losing the revolt. And at that moment, when the slaves were losing the revolt, Toussaint Louverture switched sides. He's actually going to switch to the losing side, which is astounding, right? People usually switch to the winning side. You don't switch to the losing side, right? So why would he do this? Why would he do this? Well, first of all, having once been a slave, I think he was sympathetic to slaves. He understood what it was like to be a slave. Remember, even though he had a so-called enlightened master, when the master freed him, he didn't say, oh no, I would much rather stay a slave. He accepted his freedom, right? It was better than being a slave, even to a so-called enlightened master. So I think there was a kind of sympathy there. But he also realized the problematic nature of society divided by race. He realized that as long as you could become a slave because you were black, he and other blacks, even if they were free, were always in danger of becoming slaves again. Right? He understood that there was something sick about this society. And he understood that tomorrow, if society decided to, he could be re-enslaved. And I want to stress, right, while there were free blacks, there were no enslaved whites. So this system of slavery, though it sometimes has some kind of contradictions, was based on race. Black people could be slaves, white people could not be slaves. And as long as it was a possibility that blacks could be slaves, free blacks could always, once again, become slaves. So he wanted to end the system. And to Toussaint Louverture's credit, He dreamed of a society in which whites, blacks, and mixed race people could live together. But because he switches sides, he's able to be a good leader for the slaves. He ran his own plantations. He understood military tactics. So he is key to why the slave revolt succeeds, because now they have a leader who has a vision and the ability to organize the slave revolt. So that Toussaint Louverture will help lead the Haitian people first to emancipation and then independence. And Haiti will become the second independent republic of the Americas. Now, unfortunately, Toussaint Louverture will not live to see that. He will basically be kidnapped by Napoleon and die in France. But he is key to why you're going to have not only a successful slave rebellion, but also Haiti gaining its independence. Right. So even though in some key ways the French Revolution did fail, in a sense, to bring freedom, right? I talked about some problems within France itself and how it led eventually to a dictatorship under Napoleon. We just talked about how it did not positively impact how women, even though they make good arguments for why they should also receive rights, they're not given to them. It did give a kind of hope, and it did give a kind of language that people who had been marginalized, such as women and in this case people of African descent, could use to eventually win their own freedom in the future, right? So in a sense, the French Revolution did give that kind of hope and that kind of language that could be used to push for future freedom.